In this month's episode, we introduce Vanessa Irena, author of Ecstasy, a devotional guide to the female mystics, one of Hadean Press's guides to the Underworld. Vanessa and I discuss her personal experience of negotiating and recontextualizing her relationship with Catholicism, specifically by exploring the female mystics of medieval Europe. Vanessa's work offers us a unique window into a living and enfleshed Christian experience, which, far from denying the material body, is instead vitalised within it as the vehicle through which divinity is experienced. This is a queer, erotic and transgressive mysticism centred upon the women who reclaimed their autonomy from the strictures of medieval society and independently explored the divine to become some of the most phenomenal women in European history. I am your host, Matt Hadfield, and I am very happy to welcome Vanessa Irena to the Hadean Press podcast. Vanessa, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So for our audience, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to the study and practice of magic and mysticism?
Sure. So I'm an artist and a musician, and I was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana. I was raised Catholic. I went to Catholic school. I was confirmed. My parents weren't super spiritual or religious, but my Catholic upbringing still just had a huge impact on me. I was first introduced to magic through the culture of the city of New Orleans and the prevalence of numerous strains of Southern conjure, including New Orleans voodoo, which is, with people, if people aren't familiar, is very similar to hoodoo in many ways, but it's very much its own thing. I wasn't involved with those things in any formal way, but I spent a lot of time just in the French Quarter as a teen, going to like conjure shops and visiting fortune tellers. And it's a huge part of the culture of the city, you know, getting my palm read, that sort of thing. And so that sort of, those kinds of experiences and the culture of like dual observance that exists in the city really kind of laid the groundwork for my, approach to magic and spirituality. And then later as an adult, I moved to New York City, where I lived for about 20 years. And I got involved with the magical community there. And that has really shaped my practice as well. And now I live in upstate New York in the Catskill Mountain region.
We are here today to talk about your amazing pamphlet, Ecstasy, a devotional guide to the female mystics. Now, you should know that you are the first guest that we've had on the podcast who has specifically written about the mystics as opposed to magic. And you're also one of a very small number of authors who have actually attempted to tackle the subject of women and mysticism. So this may seem like a rather daunting question, but could you describe something of the distinction between magic and mysticism?
Sure. So just to preface this, I will say that I am someone who is very firmly in the spirit model camp. So I am of the opinion that both practices are mediated through spirits and spirit contact. With mysticism, I would say being more concerned with communion with spirits, and then magic being more focused towards creating external changes in one's reality. I will also say that although one practice is more sort of internally focused and the other is more external, in both instances, I think the person is changed through this type of relationality. And I think that when they're approached this way, I think that both practices are complementary and feed into each other. And so I think that, people who take the time to, for example, develop spirit relationships and cultivate that sort of communion with spirits that tend to have better results with magic, for example. When you're doing magic and you're working with spirits, when you take time to build relationships, you can find, you eventually get to a place where you can pare down ritual and, just approach them and say, hey, can I have this or that or whatever, or that sort of thing. And I think that also, I would say that mysticism is a huge part of my practice just as an artist too. So that's that's kind of like my short answer, but obviously that's a much bigger topic, but that's sort of how I think about it.
So in the Venn diagram of mysticism, magic and art, like how does your art fit into that process?
Well, I mean, I feel like the creation of art um, is is very much sometimes it almost feels like possession to me, but I feel like spirit contact and being sort of receptive to spirit is part of it. Being in an altered state of consciousness often occurs in the creation of art, and I feel like that is similar to magic in that you're basically um grounding spiritual experience into the physical. And I think that this idea of manifesting spiritual ideas and things into the physical is similar to the way that magic happens too. You know, this sort of like earthing of spiritual energy and communion kind of thing.
And how would you describe your magic? What kind of magic are we talking about with you? You said you're in the spirit model, so you're in good company
Yeah.
there. But how would you describe it?
Well, I mean, I have a number of different practices. Some of them I can't talk about,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I have a heavy ancestor practice. I do a lot of saint work, obviously, magically. I have a number of saints that I have, both devotional and magical relationships with. For example, I work with Saint Cyprian, Saint Martha, the Dominator is one of my favorite saints.
I'm interested in the way that we can use magic and the inspiration that of the mysticism that comes with that to create art. So it's interesting talking to somebody who specifically focuses on
Mhm.
that. Yeah. So it's music is one of your major outlets?
At not at the moment. It has been. I've been sort of a musician and artist my whole life. I go back and forth between making physical art and making music. And so I recently worked on a project with my partner. We created a soundtrack for a friend's horror film. And that was really cool. But right now I'm more focused on making visual art. I make jewelry. So that's kind of like my main thing that I'm doing at the moment.
And so, what was it that captured your attention so much that you decided that you wanted to write about this subject?
So I guess I first became interested in the subject when I was studying art in high school. I remember being shown an image of the sculpture, The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa by Bernini. And it was just a really formative experience for me because it's this image of a woman and she's having this extremely profound religious experience. And she's being stabbed by an angel. And her posture and facial expression is basically like indistinguishable from someone having an orgasm. And so it was it really kind of blew me away and kind of like broke my little brain open at the time. And so that was sort of how I was first exposed to this idea of religious devotion being intertwined with eros and this kind of psychosexual undercurrent of Catholicism. And then later on as adult, many years ago, I was on somewhat of my own kind of personal healing journey where I was very focused on trying to heal my own relationship to my body and also to kind of come to terms with my own queer sexuality. So I went kind of back to my origins and back into Christianity to find examples of both embodied spirituality and also queer and transgressive expressions of sexuality, like within that framework. And I just found this rich tradition of this within mystical Christianity and particularly among the female mystics.
Right. Well, we're gonna really dig down into this as we go, but like, yeah, it's not the first thing you think about when exploring those subjects. So I'm gonna go
Yeah.
check out Christianity.
Right.
But yes, thank you for sharing that. That was really interesting. So what was it that made the female experience in the High Middle Ages, which is roughly around the time period of which we're talking about in your pamphlet, what made that experience so different from the male experience?
So at the time, women were not allowed to participate in direct ministry, and they also were denied access to the interpretation of scripture. And so they were, because those things were seen as more like masculine and intellectual pursuits. And so instead, they spent their time in these long periods of contemplative prayer and connecting with God through sort of direct experience instead. And also, another thing that heavily contributed to this was this idea of nuptial mysticism was popularized by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. He gave a series of sermons on the Song of Songs, and this concept framed the soul's relationship with Christ as a marriage, with believers being seen as like the literal bride of Christ. And that also applied to both men and women. And before that, the followers of Christ were seen as more like warriors of God, and devotion had this very strong sort of martial connotation to it. And so this new framework really kind of paved the way for a more soft and like feminine expression of religious devotion. And it kind of gave permission to women to explore the more erotic and sexual aspects of their own nature in a way that was completely acceptable in that context. So basically, like now, all of a sudden, as long as you were talking about Jesus, like you could just be as horny as you wanted, kind of. So I think it was the combination of both of those things really contributed to this culture and and this expression.
So that what was it in the culture of the day that changed, that allowed that transformation to occur?
I think it was this conception of the followers of Christ being like his wife, being the bride of Christ rather than the warriors of Christ. It
Right.
allowed for this more sort of like, this sort of softer expression of devotion that was more feminine and more like erotic in a lot of ways, and queer too, because I mean, he was saying that, the monks and priests should also consider themselves to be the brides of Christ.
Yeah, it opens up an entire new dimension to that experience, doesn't it? And because, for instance, like sexuality, especially among women, has always been so what's the right word, frowned upon, or or restrictive. It's something that only a woman could do if she was married, etc. So yeah, it's really interesting to hear about how there were essentially these places, these locations, the churches, where it was acceptable, or it was given, you were given free reign.
Right, because I mean, these things were also part of private devotion, right? These women were spending these long periods of time isolated in this long periods of prayer, and so they could explore these things privately. Whereas if they were married, or I mean, it's like a lot of these women, rejected marriage in order to pursue this type of life and experience. And so it was sort of like all of a sudden they had like privacy and time to spend alone. They were sort of given permission to explore these sort of like, romantic notions of marriage to Christ. And they finally were in a position where they sort of had some level of autonomy over their own experience and their own bodies too, which, they wouldn't have had if they were just married off or whatever.
Mhm. What I found most fascinating in your writing is that you draw a very distinct link between mystical states and, as we were just talking about, the flesh. And in modern interpretations of mysticism, we often see a strong negation or even an avoidance of recognizing the importance of the human body, especially in more modern, or maybe even Neoplatonic interpretations, abstract interpretations of mysticism. Um, I've read people taking things so far as to say that, for instance, the flesh is nothing but an illusion, or worse, maybe like the Gnostic concept, it's a prison. Um, in your writing, however, you make clear that these female Christian mystics were very much embodying their experiences within their flesh and their bones, and that it's only through our understanding of the body that such mystical states are accomplished. I mean, you named the pamphlet Ecstasy, right? After all, so which it isn't something that you often associate with the concepts of a Christian nun. So could you elaborate on this further? Could you expand on this?
Yeah. So I think it's important to remember that being in a body is literally the defining feature of the human experience, right? And, as someone who sort of spent time with those other conceptions of the body, and also spent a lot of my life kind of very dissociated from my own body, I just found those ideas lacking personally. Like I didn't find them fulfilling. And I think that, the body being the defining feature of human experience also extends to the figure of Christ, right? He was God literally in a human body that lived and died. And so these women were using their body as an instrument to connect to Christ by recreating his own bodily suffering. And then through that process, they were able to achieve these mystical states where they were able to commune with him. So the body was the vehicle for this communion, but it was also the model. Christ's body was the model, and like their own bodies were like the locus for their own devotions because they would model their own bodies after the body of Christ.
So, like, for instance, could you elaborate, say, on like stigmata or the wound on the side of Christ's body, or examples like that?
Yeah, sure. So, Catherine of Siena was one of the saints who experienced the stigmata. The wound of Christ. I get into that like a little bit. I don't get into that as much as I would like, but it's a fascinating thing. It's a fascinating thing for me that I feel like people are really, writing and talking about a lot more lately, which is very cool. But the side wound of Christ was, was a big part of their sort of erotic devotion. It was very like sexualized. A lot of them speak of drinking from the wound, entering the wound, that sort of thing. And so
It's very vaginal imagery because
yeah,
it's
exactly.
blood flows from it, but water that also comes
Yeah,
through
and
the wound,
milk,
and milk. Yeah.
too. Yeah. So, so they were sort of really obsessed with with Christ's literal body, and then, even, and that plays out in the Mass too, where with the transubstantiation, the bread is, considered the body of Christ, and the blood is the wine is the blood of Christ, that sort of thing. And so, there was this real connection to the idea of, Christ's like actual body. So, and there still is, I think that that's downplayed a lot because it's too weird for people. But yeah, so I just think that it was a huge thing for them.
So I'm really curious what you think about this. So my hobby horse is I'm really interested in mythical time. So Jesus Christ's body as a, how do I put it? Like the wounds of his body as they're happening to him, they're also happening to you in your act of
Yeah.
devotion. Assuming the body of Christ, or and experiencing his suffering, his pain in that way, in a mythic sense.
Yeah, and there's like a devotion that I talk about in the chapbook called the devotion to the precious blood of Christ, and it's like a chaplet that you pray, and each section of the rosary is sort of devoted to one instance of Christ like shedding his blood, through the process of his crucifixion. So that's something that was prayed around. And,
Mm.
I have, I personally pray that chaplet a lot. I think it's really cool and weird. And it's like, yeah, so that's something that I always kind of really was drawn to.
Okay, so you mentioned that these explorations are transgressive and erotic. And before we started recording, we were talking about the pushing the limits of transgression in modern magical practices, and how these women, these Christian nuns, were really extreme for their day for what they were doing. They were really pushing the boat out. So, what role does this sexuality play in their these nuns' encounters with the divine?
So I mean, not only were they sort of having these erotic experiences with Christ, but they were also, practicing extreme mortification in order to achieve this state. And so, when I was researching this, it really painted this picture of this almost type of like sacred BDSM, honestly, because they were, doing these like extremely violent and, awful things to themselves in order to achieve these states, like, whipping themselves, wearing hair shirts, sleeping on beds of nails, just all kinds of like crazy things, and so and a lot of the visions of Christ, which we sort of talked about a minute ago, they were having these visions of him as this, androgynous figure where his side wound was sexualized, or he was seen as having breasts that they would drink milk from and that sort of thing. So, the a lot of the actual visions that they describe were incredibly erotic and sexualized, and they were created, or they were, achieving these states through these practices of like extreme mortification in a lot of ways, and also through things like fasting, um, extreme fasting, and that sort of thing.
What were they specifically writing about, though, in these visions, in these experiences there? Oh, some of them weren't writing, they were dictating, weren't they? Because many of them couldn't write. But what's the content of these experiences in an erotic sense?
A lot of them, they were just, talking about Christ as like if you read the writings of Mechtilde Madberg, for example, a lot of her writings, they were like almost like courtly love poetry of the time, and so she was just like writing these love poems about Christ and talking about their marriage and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, even though the things aren't their writings aren't explicitly sexual, they're, just undoubtedly just filled with this sort of really intense devotional imagery and this erotic undercurrent. They're just this almost like breathless, experiences of ecstasy and that sort of thing, and describing, how it made them feel, and that and stuff like that. So
So she wrote 7 books.
mhm.
That's an achievement for a woman in this era. And another woman that you write about in this pamphlet, Julian of Norwich, although that's not her real name. Her real name is lost. But she was the first woman to ever write a book in the English language.
Yeah.
So these women they're impressive. These are really unique. Like, these are really, what's the best way of explaining it? They're very, they're treading new ground
Yeah.
in a new world of literacy. Essentially, maybe they're not personally literate, but would there have been a readership? Would there have been people who would have had access to read these documents, or were they kept quiet and secret amongst their specific churches, or how did that work?
I don't actually know. So yeah, I'm not sure actually. I mean, I'm pretty sure that they weren't, written about, or they weren't, it's not the kind of thing that anyone would have access to till like much later.
Yeah, it seems like they would have been kept private for a large part, and then later on historians would have found them, and yeah. We see examples of, as we've mentioned several times now, extreme mortification of the flesh. In the chapter dedicated to Catherine of Siena, you write that she was scourged herself with a chain and fasted to the point where she survived on nothing but the Eucharist. And she's even said to have drunk the pus from the wound of a sick woman she attended as an act of service. How does this extreme behavior beget visionary ecstasy?
I mean, I would just say that it's one of many ways in which someone achieves a state of an altered state of consciousness. So it's a state where these people become more receptive to mystical experience, more receptive to spirit contact, and also like various forms of possession. There's numerous ways that people sort of achieve these states throughout history, and that's one of them. The other forms are would say like things like drumming or meditation or that sort of thing. But that's just sort of one way
Mm.
that happens.
This is an extreme way of doing it, though. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's something about pain that is very transcendent, you know.
Could you elaborate on that further?
That, that sort of gets back into the sort of like BDSM component of it, I think, just from my own experience, getting, stuff like getting tattoos or that sort of thing, I've often found that to be, like a very transcendent experience, that sort of thing.
Endurance and then the release of it concluding.
And like extreme forms of exercise and stuff when you think about people who like run marathons. And there's this one lady that I follow on Instagram, for example, she just ran 100-mile ultra marathon. And so I sort of like followed her journey through that. And, that was just really interesting to me. These like sort of extreme lengths that people will push themselves. I've always just found that like extremely fascinating.
Let's move on to every Catholic's favorite question. To what degree does folk Catholicism overlap in a Venn diagram with the practices of necromancy?
Okay, so not only will I say that folk Catholicism is a fundamentally necromantic cult, I will even go so far as to say that organized Catholicism is a fundamentally necromantic cult. And that is a hill I will die on in the place of the skull. But yeah, both through the death and resurrection of Christ, the mysteries of Golgotha, and also just through the cult of the saints, who are the legacy of the church. So, I mean, the mystery of the death and resurrection of Jesus is is foundational to the mysteries of Catholicism. So, it's fundamental to the religion.
So, could you elaborate further on, say, the bodily remains of the saints?
Sure. So there's this idea of contagion that exists within Catholicism, and it's this idea of the sanctity that exists in the physical, and so that's also sort of tied to the body. But so for like an example of this is say that like if you have holy water, and you pour holy water in more water, then that water becomes holy water too, right? I mean, I think there's limits to how much you can dilute it, for example. But then there's this idea of relics, and so the relics, which are, revered as holy objects, and then you have classes of relics, right? So there's first class relics, and that will be considered like that's basically like the literal bones of a saint or a piece of their clothing or something like that. And then you have second class relics, which are basically like a piece of cloth that was touched to a first class relic, right? And then so then that becomes a holy object. And then there's third class relics, which are basically a piece of cloth or an object that was touched to a first class or a second class relic. And so, I mean, the relics are, revered as holy objects. The relics themselves, the pieces of the saints' bodies, perform miracles. They will often like go on tour, so you can go and visit them and you can make your own relics. You can touch something to a relic and then you've made a relic yourself. So there's this idea of like sanctity within the bodies, and then the way that that is transmitted, that is exists in Catholicism as this like through way.
So, why is it then that in the generic conception of the Christian faith that there's all this emphasis put on the human soul ascending, when you die, we go to heaven, etc. Is there something of the soul of the saint which remains within the relic, within the bone or the scrap of cloth? That what is it that makes it holy?
Yeah, I mean, I believe it's the connection to, I think that there's a connection to the spirit that exists within that, you
Mm.
know, without, I feel like it's a whole other discussion to just like talk about how, ancestor veneration works, and the sort of metaphysics of the soul and everything like that. But I do feel that there is something of the person that exists within the things that they left behind. Yeah, that's the most sort of like potent artifact of a person, if you're, within the practice of necromancy, the bones are, where it's at, kind of.
So you highlight a good number of these inspired women in your work, not only describing something of their lives, their struggles, and their mystical experiences, but also focus on these women as saints or as ancestors. You detail their virtues, patronages, feasts, novenas, prayers, and sacred sites. Is there a particular mystic whose story that you particularly like and that you would like to share with us?
Sure. So, well, I like them all, but Catherine of Siena is kind of my favorite, just because I feel like her devotions were just so extreme, and also weird. But she was born in the 1300s in like plague-stricken Italy. She had her first vision at 6 years old. She was walking near the Basilica of San Domenico. She saw Christ on a throne surrounded by Peter, Paul, and John the Evangelist. And Christ, just gazed lovingly at her with the sign of the cross and everything. And, she just like, collapsed and cried with sorrow after that. And this experience just kind of shaped her whole life. At 7 years old, she vowed to remain a virgin. She dedicated herself entirely to Christ, despite like, pressure to marry at the time. Her mother, tried to sort of beautify her in order to make her eligible for marriage, and she cut off her hair, did all these things to, sort of make herself unappealing. And eventually her father relented and gave her a space to for her to do her own sort of private devotions, and she practiced just extreme asceticism and in that space that she was given, and she experienced these like frequent ecstatic visions and encounters, and one of her visions is was her mystical marriage to Christ. And in the vision, the Virgin Mary came and presented Christ to her, who gave her a ring that was made from his own flesh. And that was, later theorized by basically meaning to be a ring made from his own foreskin. So, yeah. So, I mean, I'm really fascinated by her, by both her behavior and her visions, and just how kind of weird and extreme and bizarre both her devotions and her experiences were.
And did she write? Did she write down her experiences?
She dictated them to
Hmm.
her confessor Raymond of Capua.
And can our audience get access to this material? Can people,
It's
can you search for this?
Yeah, if you just look in the back of the chapbook, I have all the works cited, and that has links to all of their writings
Hmm.
and that sort of thing. So
Yeah, I'll include a few in the description. Yeah, thank you. It'd be really good for people to be able to just quickly access some of this material. Another one that I would particularly like to share with the audience is the music of Hildegard von Bingen. What's your opinion on her?
she's incredible. Like she's just so, I mean, she's just an amazing woman. She was just a musician and an artist, an herbalist. She wrote a ton of books on herbalism, that I love. So, she was just really a powerhouse woman.
She created her own language as well.
Yeah, the lingua ignota.
Is there any evidence that it's ever been used to create any literature?
Not to my knowledge,
Okay.
but it's possible.
It's in that same sort of wheelhouse as the Voynich manuscripts, because it's still quite mysterious, and there's still. Does it have a grammar that can actually be utilized, or is it just series of words?
It's just basically like a cipher, I believe.
It's very cool, and if people in our audience aren't familiar with it, there's also a unique script which she created for it as well. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in weird magical scripts or mystical scripts in this case, check it out and see if you can utilize it. And there's an entire dictionary, I believe, out there of her words that you can utilize to effect if you choose to. Okay, so for instance, let's say for somebody in our audience who's listening, who's never done anything like this before, never done any active work like this, magical or mystical, could you explain how someone could work with one of these saints? And yeah, and do you have any particular techniques, for instance, that you would recommend new people start? Maybe don't start with the flagellation, but
Yeah. Or,
But
if you want to, sure. But yeah, so I think that, if the first step is just read their stories, read their stories and see if there's anything about their lives that particularly resonates with someone. And then also study their patronages. So, if there's something there that relates to your own life, for example. Like for me, Teresa of Avila, she was the subject of the sculpture that I described earlier. But she also, a lot of the times, like these mystical experiences were tied to things like migraine headaches and that sort of thing. And they were connected, and I personally suffer from migraine headaches as well. And so she it was is considered a patron of migraine sufferers, and so that was something that drew me to her too. She has a prayer for headache sufferers that I put in the pamphlet. So just finding ways of connecting to them that relates to your own life. And then when you find a saint that you feel drawn to, there's a lot of them just have traditional prayers. I think novenas are a really good way to connect to saints, and they're pretty classic. And it's just like you will find that throughout the course of a novena, you're sort of in this current, where you will often have these synchronicities tied to the, what I mean? So it's like this period of, we're speaking of magical time, this period of 9 days where you're doing this devotion. And so, paying attention to your dreams, paying attention to, that sort of thing during this time is a really good way of approaching that. And then I would say, honoring them on their feast days, is a big thing. And so that's sort of like a good way to start. And then I feel like once you kind of do that, then things sort of unfold from there.
evolve as they do. Yeah. Talking about magical time and that, and the 9 days and everything. Do we know of the grave sites of any of these women?
Yeah, like, so, well, there's this whole, a whole other discussion also related to necromancy is this idea of the like incorrupt body of the saint, right? Catherine of Siena's head, I believe, resides at her chapel in Siena, I think. I'm not sure. It was brought back. Um, and there's a whole story about her head being brought back, into Italy, and basically they brought her head back in a bag, and they were stopped by soldiers, I believe. And so, when they were, they prayed to not be stopped, and then when they opened the bag, it was just like full, it appeared to just be full of roses. So that's an example of, a miracle performed by her
oh,
bones.
So, is it possible to, for instance, go on a pilgrimage to any of
these
these
Yeah, of
sites.
sites?
course, absolutely. Yeah, there's sacred sites, related to a lot of saints, and then the places where they're from,
Hmm.
where they performed miracles, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of that you can dig into.
Yeah, but these women specifically, I mean, if we're interested in, for instance, Catherine of Siena, and we want to go and check out her and say hello, and I love this idea of the magical journey, like the idea that you set yourself a goal to travel somewhere, or even if it's somewhere local, just to the graveyard or the crossroads, or to walk the length of your river in wherever you live.
Yeah,
Things
I
like
Things
think
like
that's a
that.
huge it's a huge part of it for sure.
Hmm.
Yeah.
and you're stepping into that mythic time where you're involved with the spirit. Yeah, it's something I'm really interested in. Yeah, I think it's really interesting for people who want to reconnect with saints, or if they're interested in what's the best way of putting it? Reacquainting themselves with Christianity in a healthy, embodied way, like we've been talking about today. I think this might be a really good opportunity for people to attempt that and try and learn from it.
And I think that also, I mean, the saints are just, they're folk heroes in a way. You know what I mean? They are tied to the church, but they will kind of t work with anyone as long as you're respectful of that, and they're very approachable. I feel like it's a great it's a great sort of easy practice, working with saints, that is, kind of beginner friendly in a lot of ways. So, I feel like, for someone that's interested in sort of reconnecting with Christianity or finding their way back to it in a way that's healthy because of, whatever their various experiences were, this is a good way to do it.
And these saints that we're talking about, these women saints, will be nothing but sympathetic, one would imagine.
Exactly, for
Yes.
sure.
Okay, so if there was a message that you think that these women could transmit to us in the modern day regarding our relationship with the human body and the experience of the divine, what do you think it would be?
I think that we're here in a body for a reason, and I think that experience and that aspect of our humanity is sacred and it's worth honoring.
Excellent, excellent. And finally, is there anything that you are working on right now, or anything that you're particularly obsessed with?
Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned earlier that I'm a jeweler, and I have a store called Sword and Scythe where I make jewelry, magical jewelry, and so things like amulets and astrological talismans and that sort of thing. So I have a couple of things that I'm working on related to saints, that I'm gonna be quiet about and not say exactly what they are, but those are coming out soon. But one of the things that I am super interested in lately related to this, well, one is that idea of relics and contagion and stuff is something that I'm sort of exploring. The idea that you can make your own relics. And then also, lately I've been really obsessed with the medal of Saint Benedict and the Vade Retro Satana, like the Benedict metal cross that's used for exorcism. So that's sort of like a deep dive personal exploration that I'm sort of on right now. I've always been really interested in exorcism. I just think it's fascinating. So I'm a huge fan of Francis Young, and his book on exorcism and Christianity is really interesting. So that's sort of my own pet project at the moment.
All right, well, thank you so much for sharing that with us today, Vanessa, and thank you for coming onto the podcast to talk to us about this absolutely incredible subject, this really fascinating dive into the divinity and the ecstasy of these medieval nuns. It's been really good talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was really great talking to you.
That was Vanessa Irena, author of Ecstasy, a devotional guide to the female mystics, available now from Hadean Press's Guides to the Underworld. I was really happy to get Vanessa on the show this month. I think the message of her work is something that we could benefit from, especially if we have trouble with Christianity in our practice. Vanessa's work navigates a queer-coded interpretation of Christianity and focuses on the reclamation of bodily autonomy, as well as connecting to the divine through direct experience. What she describes as nuptial mysticism, or becoming a bride of Christ, no matter if we're a man or a woman. I love the way that Vanessa describes the body as being the defining feature of human experience and the very vehicle through which mystical or divine experience occurs, as opposed to what we tend to perhaps rather ignorantly think of when we discuss modes of Christian experience which we assume to be flesh-rejecting or anti-materialist. I think that we could learn a thing or two by spending some time meditating on this. If you are interested in more from Vanessa, she has co-written another guide with Alexander Cummings titled Saint Raphael the Archangel, which I highly recommend if you are interested in working this practical magic of this most powerful healing spirit. You can also find links to Vanessa's other projects in the description below. If you have made it this far, then thank you so much. The Hadean team is so grateful for your continued interest and support in all our work. If you would be so kind as to hit the like and subscribe buttons, leave a comment, maybe even share our video, we would be so very, very grateful. Anything that you can do to help us appease the gods of the algorithm, to help our podcast and support our global authorship is greatly appreciated. Stay tuned for more to come in the future. Our next episode will be a good one. Thank you all for your continued support. Enjoy your holidays, and I will see you all again in the next one.